And welcome back to Age of Empires 2 History Lesson, as today we are going on to organization. Alright, the organization of feudal armies was kept simple in comparison to the large national armies of more modern time. There were no permanent regiments, divisions, or corps until the very end of the age. When the feudal army was summoned, each vassal traveled to the meeting point with any knights, archers, and footmen that he was required to bring. At the meeting point, the contingents would be reassembled by rule. The knights and their squires kept and marched together, as did the archers and footmen. Special units such as engineers and the operators of siege artillery were usually professionals hired for the campaign. Christian mercenaries, for example, operated the artillery employed by the Turks against Constantinople. Being a mercenary soldier was a respected profession in the late Middle Ages. Warrior entrepreneurs formed mercenary companies that allowed a rich lord or city to hire a ready-made competent fighting force. Mercenary companies existed that were all of one skill. For example, 2,000 Genoese crossbowmen served in the French army at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. I'm not pronouncing any of these things right, by the way, so don't get angry. Other mercenary companies were mixed forces with all arms. These were often described in terms of the number of lances they contained. Each lance represented a mounted men-at-arms, plus additional mounted root, foot, and missile troops. A company of 100 lances represented several hundred fighting men. This system was the origin of the word freelance. Command hierarchy within a feudal army was flat. Not much maneuvering was anticipated, so there was little provision of large staffs to support the commander and pass orders. In 1439, Charles VII, the seventh of France, raised royal ordnance companies. These companies were filled with either knights or infantry and were paid from tax revenues. Each company had a fixed complement of men. Their armor and weapons were chosen by the king rather than left to personal choice. This was the beginning of modern standing armies in the West. Supply. There was little provision for food and medical supplies. Medieval armies lived off the land to the detriment of everyone's residing in the area they occupied or passed through. Having a friendly army march through was no better than having the enemy pass. Medieval armies did not linger in one area for long because local supplies of food and forage were quickly exhausted. This was a particular problem during sieges. If an army laying siege did not make arrangements to have food and supplies brought in, might have to lift its siege to avoid starvation long before the defenders had to surrender. Sanitation was also a problem when an army stayed in one place. A medieval army brought along many animals, in addition to horses of the knights, and sewage problems led to dysentery. Feudal armies tended to waste away to disease and desertion. During his campaign in France, Henry V of England lost an estimated 50% of his army to disease at the siege of Harfleur, and more on the march leading up to Agincourt. At the battle itself, he only lost 5%. Henry V died of disease related to poor sanitation at another siege. Deployment for battle. Most battles were set-piece affairs, where the two sides arranged themselves before fighting began. Campaigns of maneuver and meeting engagements were rare. Prior to battle, commanders divided their forces into contingents with specific tasks in mind for each. First separation might be into foot soldiers, archers, and cav. These groups might be divided further into groups to be given individual missions or to be held in reserve. A commander might arrange several battles or divisions of knights. For example, these could be launched individually as desired or held in reserve. Archers might be deployed in the front of the army with blocks of infantry in support. Once the army had been arranged, the only major decisions were when to send the pre-arranged pieces. There was little provision for pulling back, reforming, rearranging once the fighting started. A force of knights, for example, could rarely be used more than once. After they had been committed to action, they were usually reinforced or withdrawn. Full charge of heavy cav caused such disruption, lost equipment, and loss of horses that the force was essentially spent. The Norman knights at Hastings were reformed for further attacks, but they did not launch a full charge because they could not penetrate the Saxon shield wall. Superior commanders made use of terrain to their advantage and conducted reconnaissance to evaluate the enemy's strength and weaknesses. Ransom. The ultimate rewards from successful battle included honors and grants of fiefs. The proximate rewards included booty from looting bodies, ransacking captured towns and castles, selling the armor and weapons of the dead, and ransoming high-ranking prisoners. Knights were expected to pay ransom to save their lives. One of the highest recorded ransom was more than 20 million US paid to a German prince for the release of Richard I of England, captured during his return from the Crusade. At Agincourt, the English were holding a large group of French knights at the rear for ransom. During the battle, a French contingent raided toward the rear of the English and briefly panicked Henry V. He ordered the execution of the held French knights to prevent their release, thereby foregoing a fortune in ransom. The capture of knights was recorded by heralds, who kept tally of which soldiers were responsible and thereby due to the bulk of ransom. Heralds then notified the prisoner's family, arranged the ransom payment, and obtained the prisoner's release. The popularity of ransom seems remarkably civil, but masks a darker story. Low-ranking prisoners of no value might be killed off of hand to eliminate the problem of guarding and feeding them. Well, that's the end of this one. I'll be back next time with strategy. See you then.